welcome you to the last Urban Growth Seminar of the fall semester. And I want to welcome Rick Cole. And I have here a formal list of Rick Cole's accomplishments, which I will read to you in just a minute. But let me also give you my qualitative assessment of his accomplishments. I have been a planning professor in Southern California for 22 years. For as long as I can remember, Rick Cole has been a really big deal. That's my assessment.
You can even Twitter that.
And that's an important point. He was an early voice for what was then called New Urbanism, now more commonly called Smart Growth. He has a record of accomplishments in several Southern California cities that is very impressive. Reading more formally from his bio, Rick Cole has an undergraduate degree in American Studies from Occidental and a master's in journalism from Columbia. He served for 12 years on the Pasadena City Council, including serving as mayor of Pasadena. He has served as city manager in Azusa and Ventura. He was recognized as one of America's Public Officials of the Year by Governing Magazine. Currently, Rick Cole is the Deputy Mayor for Budget and Innovation for Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. And in that role, he oversees 10 departments and is responsible for city budgets totaling over $7 billion. So let me welcome Rick Cole.
Thank you very much. Since this is an academic environment, I thought I'd start out with a question you might recognize from the GRE. So, urban planning is to sustainable cities as a newspaper is to the news business B, CD album is to the music business. C, railroads to the transportation business. Or D, all of the above. I'll give you a moment to think about that. What's your answer? Stumped the band. My point is this. We see urban planning as a means, but sometimes we forget it is a tool and not the end. Just as railroads seemed to be the way to get around 100 years ago, and newspapers seemed to be the way to get your news 100 years ago, and CD albums seemed to be the way to get your music within recent memory. And I'm going to argue today that urban planning is to sustainable cities no longer an effective means to the end. So, without fundamentally reimagining and reinventing urban planning, I think that urban planners will be roadkill. And unless we fundamentally change the tools that we're using for designing our cities, the practice of urban planning we know today will not survive your careers. In fact, there's real danger that you will not have paid off your student loans before the jobs disappear. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on doom and gloom. And there are always going to be defenders of the status quo. You can find them in video rental stores. But I think it's important to take a look at one central challenge if you have some, since you all have an investment in urban planning working, literally. If you're skeptical about this, have any of you noticed that we seem to be really focused these days around measuring success? Right? In sports, it's wins and losses. In education, it's standardized testing. In business, it's the bottom line. So what is the standard of success for urban planning? If you ask planners that question, you know what the answer you get is? Crickets. The reality is that they'll tell you, oh, it's really hard to measure. What we do is it's subjective. It's this long-term, complicated thing. And in today's world, you just can't get away with that. Nobody's going to let you get away with saying, I really can't give you a value, but I know it works. Especially when you look around our cities and see that it doesn't. Cops 10 years ago said the same thing. Well, crime's very complicated. It has to do with family structure and social values and unemployment and a whole lot of other things. We have a role in this, but we're really not responsible for crime. And a guy named Bill Bratton came along as chief of the Los Angeles Police Department and said, no, we're responsible. We're going to take responsibility for crime. We're going to use CompStat. We're going to measure crime. We're going to use data to pinpoint where it's happening, why it's happening, what we're doing about it, whether what we're doing about it is working. And we're going to relentlessly follow through. And the results are that every single year for the past 10 years since they put in CompStat, crime in the city of Los Angeles has declined. Nonviolent crime and violent crime have gone down. So Los Angeles today is safer than it has been any time since the 1950s. So planners can't get away with saying, well, it's complicated, it's subjective, and we really don't have, full control of that. And, well, there's the developers and the politicians and all this stuff. We have to figure out what success looks like, and I'm going to argue that success looks like making great places. So if you press planners, okay, give us metrics. What do they tell you? Well, I'm the deputy mayor in charge of measuring performance for the city of Los Angeles, so I'm the one asking those questions. And you know what they tell us? Well, how about processing time? Right? So that's the measure of success, is how whether it takes 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years to get a project approved in the city of Los Angeles. That's the best metric of success. And, if you're producing soulless mini malls and soulless apartment blocks, producing them a lot faster is not a really genuine measure of success. If processing times is your metric, I suggest you go to work for healthcare.gov, because you're kind of in that same framework. So, given that the planning profession seems stuck in this old paradigm, I'd like to talk about 5 specific tools that are kind of state of the art, what's wrong with them, and what we need to do to fix them. So let me start with zoning. Every city in America has zoning, right? Oh, it's a trick question, right? Houston doesn't have zoning. And this would be a very powerful argument for the value of zoning, because Houston is a hot mess. Except for the fact that the vast majority of America, built in the last 60 years under zoning, is indistinguishable from the vast majority of Houston. If you drive down a boulevard, a suburban boulevard in Houston, Texas, and one in Los Angeles, California, the only difference is they have Texas license plates. So, almost everything that we now value about great places, human scale, pedestrian friendliness, mix of uses, indoor-outdoor dining, are illegal under zoning and have been for the last 60 years. And it's only recently that we've even begun to legalize some of these things under things like zoning overlays and special districts. For 6,000 years, the wonderful places that we cherish today were created through a timeless way of building and/or strict form-based codes. And what's been produced over the last 60 years, the soulless, car-dominated landscape of suburban America, that is the gift that zoning has given us. And so, when you look at the places that people cherish, right? Old Pasadena, Leimert Park, downtown Redlands, Laguna Beach, all of them were produced before urban planners and zoning codes. And the places that people cherish now that have been built since then are ones that have been built in spite of zoning, like the 3rd Street Promenade, that would be illegal under conventional zoning. Zoning does not create great urban spaces. When we embarked on the revitalization of Old Pasadena and downtown Pasadena 20 years ago, we didn't have a tool to replace zoning. But today we do. Form-based coding has been tested in big and small cities all across America, draws upon the best traditions of traditional architecture developed over the last 6,000 years in all kinds of different climates and at different scales. It's anchored in a timeless way of building, and it doesn't focus on the transitory use of buildings, but on their physical form. And yet, planners cling to those zoning codes like people cling to astrology. Now, both are bogus, but astrology is not dangerous. Zoning actually kills the urban vitality and the things that we cherish. And so planners could take a page from medical doctors' ethics. And what's the first rule? First, do no harm. And yet, the city of Los Angeles, instead of scrapping zoning, you know what we're doing? We are updating, simplifying, consolidating, shortening, and enhancing LA's outdated zoning code. Right? We'll have a new, updated, simplified, consolidated, shortened, and enhanced version of cancer. So let's turn to general plans. This is the cornerstone of California planning law, and general plans are often grandly described as the constitutions of land use and transportation. And there are 488 cities and 488 general plans. And over the last 20 years, the vast majority of them have been updated. And if you read them, you start with these wonderful introductions. They almost all sound alike, and they all talk eloquently about fill in the blank, Santa Monica, Irvine, Garden Grove, will be a great place to live, work, and play. And will emphasize urban vitality and livability and sustainability. And yet the vast majority of them leave in place the noxious zoning rules, the parking ratios, the grotesque street standards, and all of the things that kill livability and sustainability and environmental good practices. So they start out promising all these grand things, but then leave in place all the things that gave us all the stuff that is unlivable and unsustainable. And as a great American economist once said, things that are unsustainable have a tendency to come to a stop. Now this is a little abstract for most people, so he simplified it to things that can't go on forever, don't. And yet we perpetuate these codes, have the courage to dream big, but not the political will to actually put it into effect. And in part, it's important to make this distinction. Most planners think plan is a noun. Right? The purpose of planning is to produce plans. The great American father of the planning profession, Daniel Burnham, said, "Make no little plans," which modern planners understand to mean no plan should be less than 500 pages and have a 1,000-page environmental impact report. But plan is also a verb. And so planning is not an end in itself. The purpose of planning is not to complete the plan and send it to the American Planning Association to qualify it for an award. The purpose of creating a plan is to help guide the action of people, public and private, in shaping great urban places. And if that's the goal of general plans, by and large, they utterly fail. In Pasadena and Azusa and Ventura, where I played a role in originally revising general plans, we found we had to junk them entirely. We had to start over again from scratch in rewriting the general plan. We had to literally start from a blank piece of paper. And not only the words, but the very process was completely counterintuitive to the conventional way that most cities go about writing their general plans, which is to immediately hire a consultant who's written 17 other general plans. And they bring their briefcases and their word processors and they substitute, Santa Monica for Garden Grove. But instead, we started with the values of those three communities and the built environment and the traditions and the climate and the aspirations of the people in those cities and built the general plans from the ground up. Now, all three of those general plans won major American Planning Association awards. It's too soon to evaluate the long-term success of Ventura and Azusa. But I don't think there's any doubt that anyone that looks at Pasadena over the last 20 years sees that the general plan vision adopted in 1992 played a decisive role in the renaissance of that city. So let me turn from general plans to specific plans, because some people say, well, general plans have their flaws, but you can make up for those flaws by having specific plans. And it's kind of the state of the art in the planning profession in California. And they are supposed to set the framework for preserving and enhancing and creating great places. And some do. Most do not. Specific plans are almost always underwritten by developers. And there are some great developers, and they often sponsor great plans. There are a lot more mediocre developers, and that's why you have so many mediocre specific plans. There literally isn't you can't substitute. If you're clueless generally, you don't get a clue specifically. You can't fill the vacuum left by lack of vision about the built environment at the city level with a specific plan for a piece of the city. Specific plans are at best a clunky workaround, and at worst, they're a scam. Now, I haven't said anything about the role of the public in planning. So let me cite as kind of the fourth. We talked about zoning, general plans, specific plans. Let me talk about the fourth great pillar of California planning today, which is the public hearing. Dan Kemmis says, public hearings are that place in our public life where no one listens. Have you ever been to a planning hearing? So you have one group of people who are opposed, and they say, if you build this building in my neighborhood, it will be the end of Western civilization as we know it. I'm going to bring the cold dead body of my child run over by the traffic generated by this project. And the blood will be on your hands. And then on the other side, the business people, this will bring jobs and prosperity. A city that doesn't grow will stagnate. This is an important consideration for the future of our city. And we demand that you approve this project to bring jobs and prosperity and economic development and pay for the services. Is anyone listening? Is anyone persuaded? The decision makers have read the 500-page plan and the 200-page staff report and the 1,000-page environmental impact report, and they've waded through hundreds of emails and texts and letters. So by the time you get to the end, the people passionately shouting, and thank you, your 3 minutes are done, please sit down. Planners say, well, the reason we have to do that is because it's state law. What if it was state law that you had to use typewriters? Would planners peck away? It would take a long time to write those 1,000-page environmental impact reports. There are better ways of involving the public. Have we adopted them? Are they the standard? No, we still have public hearings. There is a vital role for citizens to engage in the life of their cities, in their neighborhoods around them. But it's not public hearings. And it's not battles over specific projects. In the end, planning cannot be a profession. It has to be a passion a passion we share with the citizens that we serve. So let me turn, we talked about zoning, general plans, specific plans, and public hearings. Let me turn to what I would call the final indignity, the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as CEQA, also known as the California Employment for Environmental Planners Act. It would be hard to find a law more misused and abused than CEQA. We shouldn't adjudicate the built environment. Judges make lousy urban designers. Reform of CEQA is actually simple. It's just not easy. You just categorically exempt all infill development. And if that's too radical, then you do what Jerry Brown did when he passed an exemption to CEQA. You can read it online. Passed the legislature, signed by the last governor. Said in cities, in counties under 1 million, that have more than 200,000 population, that have adopted a general plan that is in compliance with state law, may categorically exempt housing development, housing infill development. Now it turns out that there's only one city in California in a county less than 1 million that has more than 200,000 population, and Jerry Brown was the mayor of that city when he proposed that law. Now he's the governor of the state. If it's good enough for Oakland, it's good enough for California. So let me conclude with a kind of larger challenge to the current state of planning in California and beyond. In the end, a great plan is not one that wins an award from the American Planning Association. A great plan is one that leads to the preservation and enhancement of great places. And we all know them when we see them. People complain vociferously about gentrification. And I sympathize. But why do those places have nosebleed prices? Because there's so few of them, right? Supply and demand. If we had a huge supply of places that people liked, they wouldn't be so bloody expensive, right? It's because there aren't very many old Pasadenas, there aren't very many downtown Santa Monicas, and there are very few of them in lower income neighborhoods. That's why it's so unaffordable. What if urban planners help foster those kind of environments as the rule and not the exception? What if livable communities wasn't an overlay zone? What if livable communities was the standard? So let me just finish with one of the great success stories of the last 20 years. I may have to refer back to the notes just for some of the details. But in 1999, the city of Los Angeles passed the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance, which scraped away all of the bureaucratic red tape that stood in the way of taking those beautiful commercial buildings in downtown Los Angeles that were empty and allowing them to be reused. And at the time, the mayor appointed a guy named Hamid Bedad, who was not a planner but an engineer, and he was given blanket authority to ensure that the new ordinance was implemented. For the next 7 years, he tirelessly bent every rule. He bypassed every bureaucrat. He ignored every political adversary that stood in the way of turning those beautiful old buildings back into tax-producing buildings that had some value and use. And by the time he quit in 2006, more than 4,000 units of new housing were occupied. More than 4,000 additional units were under construction, and more than 3,000 beyond that were in the planning pipeline. Now that is success you can measure, right? That is an outcome that is tangible. That is a success of a planning policy. 12,000 individuals and families living back in the core of the city, bringing new life, new vitality, new investment back into the core of the inner city and reusing these beautiful old buildings instead of having them sit empty or be torn down for parking lots. Here's the problem, and it's also an opportunity. So Hamid Badad was given authority over the fire department and the building and safety and the planning department and public works department. You can knock heads, you can twist arms, you can do any of that stuff when it comes to getting these buildings permitted. But nobody gave him authority over what happened in the neighborhood around it. So when the first people moved in, they walk out on the street, and what do the streets look like? They look like Dante's Inferno, right? They were filthy. They were broken. They were ugly. They were dangerous. They were filled with hypodermic needles. Nobody gave him authority over a critical dimension of success. And that's the opportunity for planners. Is if you spend your careers writing plans, not on typewriters, maybe not on computers, maybe you'll be talking into your watches. But if that's what you do, is you're writing rules and regulations, then you're not going to capture this enormous opportunity, which is to make a lot more great places in America for people to live and for us to globally compete with places that are better than us and better at making new places than us. Unless you are involved in a team effort, in an effort that goes beyond just, okay, the plan's done, now it's somebody else's problem to implement. If planners were really integral, not just to the envisioning of great places, but to the implementation and the bringing to life, think of what a satisfying career that would be. It's about a holistic approach, not a legalistic approach. So I just should conclude with a story. I was mayor in Pasadena when Old Pasadena was suddenly discovered. In fact, when I met President Obama, he said, "Oh, yeah, I used to spend a lot of time in Pasadena. You were the mayor then." I said, "Well, you're not that much younger than me." But he was there before it was discovered as an Occidental student. But suddenly in 1992, when One Colorado opened, the place just exploded. Suddenly, everything. In Southern California, people are out walking, shopping, dining. It's not a mall. How does this work? It was an overnight success that we had spent 20 years bringing into being. So, suddenly we had these delegations from every other city in California. Literally. They came to Old Pasadena. And they'd go to lunch, and then they'd make an appointment with the mayor, and they'd sit down in my office, and they'd say, "Mayor, this is amazing. This is fantastic. We would love this in Temecula. How do you do it? Really, what's the secret? Is it the parking strategy? Is it your plan? Is it the police patrols, the foot patrols? What's the secret? You've got 80 restaurants in 14 square blocks. How do you do that? I suppose it's very simple. Half the people at those 80 restaurants in 14 square blocks are delegations from other cities wondering, how the hell do you get 80 restaurants in 14 square blocks? The reality is, unlike those commercials you see on TV that say, don't try this at home, right? Professional driver, closed course. This can be done in any neighborhood in Southern California. And it needs to be done in every neighborhood in Southern California. I'll tell you just one last story. I went with my dad when I was mayor of Pasadena to Italy. It was my first visit to Europe. He would take a siesta during the afternoon. And you can get a sense of what kind of policy wonk I was. While he was sleeping, I would go to the planning department. Not to a museum. I wasn't, sitting on the Spanish Steps having a gelato. I would go to the planning department. So I started out in Milan, and I went to the foyer, and I was looking, and it's in Italian, so I thought it might be I'd have to figure this whole thing out. I found someone who spoke English, and I quizzed them, where's the planning department? So I, tried to explain. Maybe they just didn't understand, the translation. No capisce. So finally, I discovered that in Italy, it's the Department of Urbanismo, which in my pidgin Italian either means city stuff or city things, or in a more earthy term, city, and urbanismo, right? It's not planning. It's the stuff that makes cities work. That's what planning ought to be about. It's not just about policies and laws and plans and documents and hearings. It's about the real life of entrepreneurs who put their blood, sweat, tears, and life savings into breathing an old building back to life. It's about a neighborhood activist who cares passionately about their neighborhood. It's about us choosing to go to a local business instead of spending all our money at Walmart or Costco or Target. It's about local politicians allocating resources, so instead of once a week cleaning in a place that people like, you clean them every day, because that's what Rick Caruso does, and that's what Walt Disney did, and why should we have any worse user experience just because it's a city? That is urbanismo. That's what we need. That is not going to go out of style. You'll be able to pay your student loans back if you practice urbanismo. You will be very valuable to the future. This is the first time in human history that a majority of the world's people actually live in cities. For the last 6,000 years, cities have been the fountain of civilization. In fact, the word city and civilization are the same Latin root, right? Civic, city, citizen, civilian. It's all the same word. But most people were farmers, right? They fed the cities. And we needed tons of farmers to feed the cities. Now we don't need so many farmers, so people are pouring into cities literally at the rate of 1 million a week. 1 million people leave the farms and go to the cities every single week. They're pouring into Jakarta, they're pouring into Johannesburg, they're pouring into Nairobi, they're pouring into Shenzhen, they're pouring into Guangzhou, they're pouring into Seoul. They're pouring into cities all over the world. And if we can't make Los Angeles work, if we can't create great streets, if we can't get the police department to talk to the planning department, to talk to the public works department, to get them to work together with the business improvement district and the neighborhood association and the merchants and the developers, and actually create great places, not just for wealthy people, not just for people that have plenty of time. We have to do something more than make the world safe for Starbucks. We have to make the world safe for 4 billion people who today live in cities. 4 billion people. Over the next 15 years, in China alone, 250 million people are going to leave the cities, leave the farms, and go to the cities. 250 million people. That's almost the entire size of the United States of America, and they're going to move in the next 15 years to a place that doesn't exist, right? There's no room for them there today, so they not only have to build the buildings, they're going to have to expand the sewer treatment plants, they're going to have to hire the police officers, they're going to have to build the fire stations, they're going to have to do all of that in the next 15 years. So urban planning has a huge future because, you know, news is not going away, and music is not going away, and transportation, they're not going away. Newspapers, probably. CDs, absolutely. Railroads, not a bright future. So let's get out of the urban planning business, if urban planning means specific plans and general plans and zoning codes and public hearings. Let's get into the urbanismo business and build great places for 4 billion people. Thank you.
What? Oh.
Thank you, thank you. Let me introduce our discussant, who many of you know. Professor Liz Falletta is an assistant professor here at the Price School. She teaches architectural and urban design. She's also an assistant professor in the USC School of Architecture. Bachelor's degree from Washington University and a master's in real estate development from here at USC Price. Liz has managed real estate development firms, providing middle market housing and entitlement consulting services, among other very interesting things. Let me leave it at that. Liz Falletta.
Thank you. Rick, that was fantastic. All of my students in the room, I would like you to pay very close attention to what Rick said, especially about thinking about places holistically and especially about thinking beyond boundaries, right? Much of what Rick talked about came down to design, right?
Absolutely.
And that was kind of the elephant in the room. That word never got said, but design is how we are going to start to evaluate a lot of the places that Rick is talking about. So the idea that we get beyond the pro forma in all senses, right? We're not just looking at numbers. We're not just following, what everybody else has done. We're not just filling in the blanks. We're not working off checklists, right? You know, architects' perspective of planners is that they just have checklists, and that's how it gets done, right? So I want all of you, in my class or not, to really pay attention to this idea that all of these things that we're working on come together as our experience of the city, right? And that's how we're going to evaluate it, and that's how our constituents are going to evaluate it. That's how everybody is going to, that is our first measure of the city, right? Is that experience. So thank you for helping me do my job. That's fantastic. Please come to sit on my review for my students' projects. They're good. They're really good. So my question as an architect, you talked a lot about measuring the success of urban planning and urban planning activities by the places that are created with them. Makes total sense. But what are some of the metrics we might use to evaluate one place against another? You talked a lot about livability and walkability, mixed use, outdoor dining. But if we just take some of the projects that were talked about, Old Town Pasadena, I'm there every day having coffee in Intelligentsia, sadly. for my pocketbook. However, Eagle Rock, Colorado Boulevard and Eagle Rock. I live in that neighborhood. Do I ever have coffee there? No. Or very, very rarely, because they don't have my preferred dance class there. Or the Americana at Brand, right? Has a Nordstrom's, that gets me there. I end up staying there longer than I expect, right? So those are all places that are walkable. They're all places that have mixed uses. They're all places that have all of these elements, but they're radically different, and I would argue more or less successful.
So I'm actually not an urban planner. I just played one on television as a city manager and mayor. And so one of the rules, Professor, that we have about metrics is we force the departments to come up with their own, because if I come up with a metric and I say, this is how I'm going to measure you, then they don't own it. Then it isn't theirs. But that aside, let's take a look at walk score, right? This is not something that planners came up with, at least not as a profession or not on the public side. But walk score is a way of measuring how much there is within a proximity of things like a library, transit, everyday retail, dining, park, what have you, within reasonable walking distance. And at a finer grain, what's the experience going to the park, right? Is it, do you have to cross a 6-lane boulevard, or it could be across the street, but if it's a 6-lane street, then that's not very walkable. What if the measurement for urban planning success in Los Angeles was the percentage of neighborhoods that have a walk score above 8.0 or whatever? What if, as our mayor has launched what I think is the quintessence of where we should be going, which is the Great Streets program, which is not to wait for a plan, but to plan these things even as we go along. And so what if we had a measure of the percentage of boulevards in Los Angeles that would qualify as great streets? These are outcome measures. These are things that aren't about what we want to have, but are we actually producing them? The challenge is you want dynamic measures. And so it does take a while for these things to happen. So it's a little hard to measure in the first quarter how well you're doing. So you have to have milestones along the way. But again, if you look at the CompStat model, in real time they're using data. And so if you're starting with a god-awful street, Canoga Boulevard in the valley, then you start and say, how many pedestrians, right? And how many days between pedestrians? And if it begins to shorten, that you see a pedestrian at least every other day, then you're moving in the right direction. And so I think those are some of the ways in which we can begin to get our arms around the money ball of cities.
I have my own metric, actually, that I use in my class. It's, would you take a date there? Which actually turns out, if you think about spaces, I had a student who took a date to Pershing Square, and I was horrified by this. But it seemed to work out for him. They were still dating. So.
And would you let your 15-year-old daughter go there, which is my stage of life? That's a good question.
So I'd like to open it up to questions from you guys.
Or comments. You don't have to disguise your question in the form of a comment.
Or your opinion in the form of a question. Yes.
You mentioned the adaptive reuse ordinance and the great success it was for the city. I know the same event when the mayor announced the Great Streets Initiative, there was a lot of talk about that ordinance and how it can continue to evolve and be successful. How do you see that playing out in downtown, and how do you see the mayor's office in the city and the private sector working to continue to make sure that we are reusing existing existing building stock, not just residential, but maybe for commercial and other uses, and basically putting the bones back to work, if you will?
Two pieces to that. One's pretty abstract, but critical, and one's very tangible and on the ground. The pretty abstract one is that we have 37 departments in the city of Los Angeles who never talk to each other. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it is less of an exaggeration than I would like to think. And so one big piece, which the mayor is dedicated to doing, is to get the departments to talk with each other, to collaborate with each other, to work together, because there are very few problems that fall within just one department and can be solved by just one department. So the kind of creating a better environment for downtown, continuing the positive momentum, is something that's really going to have to take place. You know, the police department can't make it safe all by itself. The public works department can't make it passable and accessible all by itself. Those things work together along with a bunch of other things. So that's at the big level, and it's important, but it's a little abstract for people. It's not the sort of thing that you stop the presses and write a front page story about. Great Streets is at the opposite end. Great Streets, the mayor's initiated this process where basically all across Los Angeles, people who aspire to either improve or create, you know, the bones of a great street on their boulevard in their neighborhood will have the opportunity to sort of nominate places, and there'll be some kind of competitive environment in which we hope that we can look at what people are willing to bring to the table, right? Because it isn't the job of city government to create great streets. We have an important role. We can be a catalyst. We can be a convener, but it's not our job. We are one of the partners in creating great streets. So this process, I think, will generate some real buzz. So the ones that are successful will then become tangible pilots, and we'll be able to see what works and what doesn't work, and what works really well and what doesn't work so well. And not only will those things be useful for when you begin to scale up to other great streets and designate other great streets, other people will say, well, I ain't waiting, right? I'm not waiting until I'm designated a great street. My merchants association, my neighborhood association, my little small business is going to do something right here on my block, and we're going to take the lessons both that have been learned in Silver Lake or Hollywood or Echo Park or Pasadena or Long Beach or Santa Monica and begin to apply them to some of the godforsaken boulevards in the city of Los Angeles and begin to breathe new life back into them. And if you look at the neighborhoods, most times it's the streets that drag down the neighborhoods rather than the opposite. Particularly with today's tremendous demand for housing, usually the neighborhoods are in better shape than the boulevards. And if the boulevards begin to generate new life, they in turn will strengthen the neighborhoods. So I think those are the two places. The abstract, getting departments to work together at this 4 million scale, and then right at, on your block, on your street, actually getting people to pick up trash, right? Begin to paint buildings, begin to open long, empty storefronts, begin to hold street fairs, do all that stuff that may not seem as glamorous as building, a $1 billion project for a new sports stadium. But really has a lot more to do with livability than a new sports stadium.
Go for it. Allison.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about the overlay zones. I know you mentioned that it would be preferable to have livable communities as a standard, but with the development of overlay zones, do you see that as like a stepping stone, or how do you see that?
Yeah. It's kind of like BlackBerry. They've made some improvements. It's really helped their bottom line. They're doing great, right? Let's start, if China can build brand new cities for 250 million people in 15 years, some of it's not great, but some of it's it's surprising how good it is, given how fast they're building it and how much of it they're taking from us. I mean, they're using some of our worst god-awful examples and replicating them at huge scale. But but some of it is much better. If they can do that, why are we futzing around with overlay zones and all that stuff? We know what works. We have 6,000 years of experience and 60 years of failure. How brain dead are we, right? I mean, the world is moving at internet speed, at gigabit speed. And planning departments are moving at glacial speed. And, you know, at some point, again, that which can't go on forever won't. So I have very little patience for the idea that we should test mixed use. We should pilot less parking. You know, go to Old Pasadena. It works! You can kick the tires. You can walk up and down. It's not a Hollywood set. It's a real urban place. It makes a lot of money. It's worth a lot. The value there is sky high. And other cities, well, I don't know, seems kind of radical. We need at least 4 parking spots for every 1,000 square feet of restaurants. And so you better tear down that building next door to you and build a parking lot, because people got to park someplace, and we sure don't want them parking in the neighborhood, because we'll hear about that. And I'm all for housing, but, you know, we've got plenty of affordable housing as it is, and, you know, those people live there. And transit's great, but, you know, most of the people in our neighborhood don't use transit. And the people who clean our houses, well, I guess they'll have old cars. You know? Wake up and smell the 21st century. You know, we have a bunch of aging baby boomers clinging to a suburban dream, and they won't let go. And it ain't working for BlackBerry. You know, the Los Angeles Times, you know, I have more, my toilet paper is more substantial these days than the Times. Yeah, it's practically disappeared. It's the incredible shrinking newspaper, right? It used to be the most powerful institution in Southern California. And today it's, you know, what, 16 pages for the front section. So yes, we can do overlay zones and pilot projects and do all that stuff. And meanwhile, the world is going to pass us by. And go to Singapore, go to Tokyo, go to Hong Kong, and I think we can build better places. I don't think we should build giant skyscrapers. That's not my idea of livability. But we can't even build 3-story walk-ups, right, without going through endless hearings and endless hand-wringing and endless all this stuff. And, well, I think I've made my point.
I think Bree actually had a question, and then, is your name Jennifer?
No, it's also Allison.
It's also Allison, okay.
Very brave of you to just get.
I learned it this summer, I just clearly forgot it.
So I just want to go back to the measuring success thing for a moment, because I'm really interested in this, and I think I agree that we have outdated measures or insufficient measures of success, right? But how do we come up with new measures? And I think from a design standpoint, this is how do you from a design standpoint see that we can move the discourse to like the standards being something else? And then Rick, how do you feel like from the public sector you can really move so that we're not the only ones talking about the need for these new metrics, and how do we get that kind of recognized?
Well, I really appreciated Rick's comment about going to whoever is producing this thing, come up with the measurements. So it's vested, it makes sense for their discipline. I'm going to guess that architects are not going to be that interested in that, because architects, you know, rarely look beyond property lines. You know, it's measured by the personal success of that designer and, you know, awards like you spoke about. And, you know, if I did, you know, architects are like, if I didn't design it, it's not good, right? That's sort of the architect mode. It's a really good question. This is not a question I've thought about beyond bad date urbanism, which is an article I hope to write in the future. But
Probably a blog post.
a blog post. I don't know. I actually think dating has a very applicable role to play in the design process, just as an analogy, right? At the beginning, we're dating around, right? We're not getting married.
I'm asking her out. I
yet.
just
Yeah.
Pershing Square.
Yeah, I know.
I hear it's really nice
know.
these
We
days.
could go on that. Yeah. But I think, for me in my classes, it comes down to what is the experience, and are there people there, and is it a place that I feel comfortable in? Is it a place I would take my parents? Is it a place I want to spend time in? So it comes down to how many people are there, how much time do I spend, what are the activities I can do when I'm there, does one thing lead to another, or is it a single use? So I think the measures would be along those lines and less, and they might be about aesthetic consistency, they might not. I think one thing that strikes me in this whole conversation is a lot of the places we're talking about are old. Few of them are new. And then, the whole overlay zone question, I think, for example, with the whole zoning rewrite and form-based codes and all of these things, what's the distance we're traveling from where we are now to where we hope to be, and how do we take some of the DNA that exists and propel it into the future, into what we do want our cities to be like, and then how do we achieve consensus on what we want our cities to be like in the first place, which is another question.
Remind me what the question about the public sector was?
Just, so we have this very cyclical, the political cycle, like how do we advance some kind of new vision, and not just a vision, but advance the paradigm of how we measure things, when in the public sector we're dealing with, the political cycle, we're dealing with very ingrained ways of measuring things. So what do you think, not just to come up with good metrics, but how to advance that paradigm of what the metrics are in the public sector kind of context?
Well, I have great hope for this generation. They're not particularly inclined to come to public hearings, my guess is. And there isn't a mobile app for citizenship, right? There's not a way to sort of a shortcut to do it, while you're multitasking, right? It actually does require a fair amount of hard work to not only reach out to your fellow citizens, but to listen and dialogue with them and build coalitions and find common ground. It's really hard work. The great thing about it, though, is it's really wonderful work. It's very fulfilling and heartening work. I've been doing it on and off for the last 30 years, and I've been incredibly privileged. We live in a great and diverse democracy that we take for granted, right? The idea that if we disagree, no one kicks in the door and takes us away in the night and throws us in a place and then throws away the key. That's something that a good part of the world doesn't take for granted, and we do. But the opposite, which is the opportunity to connect up with people of different backgrounds, of different walks of life, getting them around a table and figure out what can we do together and actually build a place and feel like a sense of ownership. I grew up in Pasadena, and I go back there, and I see what an incredible place it's turned into in the last 20 years. And the places that aren't a whole lot better are places that we just didn't think through how hard it was going to be. Right? We had tremendous success in downtown. We have tremendous success around the light rail stations. We also envision similar success in some of the underinvested neighborhoods in the northwest part of the city. There has been some progress there, but not nearly as much as we hoped and envisioned. I think some decisions should have been made along the way to direct investment into the Northwest, and I think there were ways in which the public sector could have been more active on that. But that's ultimately back to your question, which is political will, right? There's no substitute in a democracy for kind of majority sentiment, or at least a very committed and passionate group of a minority of people who are at least willing to make the case and bring people around. But you know, this is our president talked about, you know, this wonderful lady that he met in South Carolina that taught him fired up, ready to go, that chant that became kind of the signature. And he learned that, you know, in some backwater town in South Carolina from this elderly state legislator. And it really struck him. And he said, you know, if a single voice can change a room, then it can change a city. And if it can change a city, it can change a state. And if it can change a state, it can change a nation. And if it can change a nation, it can change the world. So if you're passionate and you care and you reach out to other people, that's the way change gets made. That's why there's no more slavery. That's why gay marriage is legal now in 13 states. That's why universal health care is no longer something that's you know, a completely unachievable dream. It's just a technical glitch. And you know, it's citizenship is really hard work, but it's good work. And just because you're doing it in the profession, you sort of say, well, I give it the office. Well, no, you have to be active. James Rojas, you know, there's a model of someone who's a planning professional, but who's really gone way, way beyond that. And I think he gets the Nobel Prize for civic engagement, if there was one.
I think Allison had a question, and then
Mine's just building on political will. You talked a lot about China, and I think it's a great example for drastic change, but obviously it has flaws and
Sure.
there have been some disasters. But
Sure.
my question was more, I think you were answering with Bree about political will, so democracy's great.
If we're going this speed and they're going that speed, probably
In the
the
middle, is it political will? Like, how do we create these changes that, you know, democracy's great, it allows for debate, and it also requires consensus. But that's slow sometimes, especially in the current environment. So how, when you were mayor, like, how did you build that political will and that, I don't know, effort to change what Pasadena was?
Well, let me tell you just one example of this. I really felt we actually had to revise the general plan from scratch, and because of the technicalities of a legal settlement, we actually had to have the voters approve the general plan, right? And in California, the default on any complicated question is no, right? If it's complicated, you just vote no, right? And so general plans are really complicated, right? So the default answer is no. So we had to get a majority of the residents of Pasadena not only to, you know, come and support the general plan when it got adopted at the city council, we had to put it on the ballot and have the majority of them vote. And the election we were teed up for was November 1992, which actually was the highest voter turnout in post-war America. And so we were on that ballot. And so when I went to the planners, I said, folks, we're going to have thousands of people involved in writing this general plan, because we're going to be at the ballot box. And if they don't understand it, don't feel an ownership in it, we're going to go down like a rock. So the planner said, well, Rick, that's really idealistic of you, but you know, literally, we've been doing this for years, and thousands of people are not interested in planning issues, right? We send out thousands of postcards, and we get, you know, the same 30 people. We could have our meeting in a snowstorm at midnight on Christmas Eve, and those 30 people would show up, right? And that's it, right? So I said, well, look, we've got to go to the ballot box. We've got to have thousands of people involved in this process, and we're going to have to interest them. And frankly, if you ask them about transportation and jobs and livability, if they're not interested in that stuff, check their pulse, right? Because that's really important stuff. So I said, well, Rick, okay, let's assume you're right and we can get thousands of people interested in this stuff, and they all descend on us. The public hearing, right, they all get 3 minutes, 1,000 people, that's 3,000 minutes, you know, that's a 3-day public hearing. I said, come on, guys, we're not going to have a public hearing. We're going to get people around tables. We're going to have them do simulation games. We're going to have them dialogue with each other. We're going to do small group breakouts. We're going to do all this stuff that people do if they really genuinely want to engage with people. We're not just going to have a public hearing. Okay, fine, fine. But they love their cars. And we're urban planners. We went to school. We know that we've got to move to alternative transportation. This is 20 years ago, right? And their vision of Southern California was you'd have to pry people's cold, dead hands off the steering wheel, right? Go around and take away their car keys, and force them into transit. So he said, we get these thousands of people, and they're all going to say, we want wider roads, and we want, less development in our neighborhoods, and, all the stuff. They're NIMBYs. They're not in my backyard. So I said, guys, if that's what they think, then how are we going to win this election, right? Unless we bring people from here to there. Well, it turns out they weren't here. If you ask them superficial, stupid, short-sighted political questions, like, do you want development in your neighborhood? Well, hell no. But if you ask them, how are we going to provide jobs and opportunity for your kids and have a tax base that's going to make sense and protect your neighborhood and take care of the parks and keep the libraries open, how's that all going to work? Well, that's a more nuanced and interesting and challenging question. And when people get engaged in that kind of thing, then you get away from that sort of binary yes, no kind of a deal, and people begin to understand just how interesting and challenging all this stuff is. So I said, let's do it that way. Let's do this experiment. Read the general plan of the city of Pasadena. It says, and I think it's the fourth principle, Larry, you might remember it. Pasadena will be a city where people can circulate without cars. That was adopted in 1992 by a vote of the citizens of Pasadena.
So that's what I was going to say. I was an observer in the city at the time that Rick was mayor. I was a journalist there as well as a longtime friend. But what he did was make what people were voting on, what we were voting on, was not the complicated planning language. The language we were voting on was language like that. So people could really understand it, and that's why A, it passed. But B, and prior to that, many, many hundreds of people, thousands of people,
3,200 people
came out to these workshops where we got to play with buildings and houses and streets, and it made your profession, the fun of it, because you're planning the world, and that is fun. But the language isn't fun. But the actual work of it, when people got into those workshops, was a kick, and that's what got people enthusiastic about it, and that's why it worked. So to me, distilling it down into the language like you got onto the ballot was so key. And that was basically your language. You already knew that. And I would say, I don't mean cynically, but it was giving people the perception that they had planned out the city as well as letting them plan out the city. Because you already had a vision. And that's pretty much what we adopted. It doesn't mean that the people didn't bring stuff to it, but you kind of brought us along, is what I mean to say. And the perception that it was your idea is just as good as it being your idea.
Well, and I appreciate that, Larry, and it's not out of any false modesty that I say this. Ultimately, leadership doesn't come down to whether you're the mayor, or the deputy mayor, or the city manager, or the planning director, or the department chair, or the president of the university. Leadership comes down to something pretty simple. Is anybody following? Right? If nobody's following, you might be a pioneer, you might be an entrepreneur, you might be a visionary, but you're not a leader, right? That's okay. But if people are following you, you don't have to have a title. You're a leader. And I think there was a time. Pasadena was tired of battling growth, no growth, growth, no growth, growth, no growth. It was not very interesting. It was not very productive. It wasn't leading to positive results. We were suing each other. There was a hunger for a different way. And so people began, when they engaged in those exercises, they began to see that there was an alternative, right? It wasn't high-rise next door to you or nothing ever built in the city ever again. That we could concentrate development around transit stations, that we could bring more housing at higher densities into the downtown versus into the lower density residential neighborhoods, that we could have a street life that would enliven it so they weren't just soulless corporate towers, that all those pieces, all that made sense to people, whether they discovered it on their own or whether they discovered it by looking around at what was working in Southern California and beyond, or whether they just were following a leader. It's all of the above. It's ultimately about if you have a compelling vision and no one's leading, I mean, if no one's following, then it's not really a compelling vision. So the fact that we got to that vision, the fact that it got adopted, and then the fact that it got built indicates that there was very solid support for a different way of doing business, and we got it done.
Let me pause, if I might. Pause before I say that we've reached our time and then gone past. So I would like to thank both Rick Cole and Liz Valletta for a very engaging